Well, good evening, folks. It's Clay Steele here, and we're around the fire, as we always are here in the evenings. And we're having a little coffee and a little chat, laughing a little bit about some stories, catching up. That's what we do around here. You know, I got some more of those stories. Well, I want to read you a couple more chapters from this story I've been reading you. You know, The Untamed by Max Brand. It's a great story. Good old cowboy story, and that's the strongest old boy you ever heard of. And, well, the last you heard of him, they got in a fight. It seemed like the bad guy knocked the good guy down. You know, got to find out what happened next. So let's carry on. This here's chapter 7, The Mute Messenger. Almost at once, Haynes raised a hand and spoke to the crowd. "He's all right, boys. Badly cut across the head and stunned, but he'll live." There was a deep gash on the upper part of the forehead. If the crossbar of the chair had not broken, the skull might have been injured. The impact of the blow had stunned him, and it might be many minutes before his senses returned. As the crowd closed around Dan, a black body leaped among them, snarling hideously. They sprang back with a yell from the rush of the green-eyed fury, but Black Bart made no effort to attack him. He sat crouching before the prostrate body, licking the deathly white face and growling horribly, and then stood over his fallen master and stared about the circle. Those who had seen a lone wolf make its stand against a pack of dogs, they recognized the attitude. Then without a sound, as swiftly as he had entered the room, he leaped through the door and darted off up the road. Satan, for the first time deserted by this wolfish companion, turned a high head and neighed after him, but he raced on. The men returned to their work over Dan's body, cursing softly. There was a hair-raising unearthliness about the sudden coming and departure of Black Bart. Jim Silent and his comrades waited no longer, but took to their saddles and galloped down the road. Within a few moments, the crowd at Morgan's place began to thin out. Evening was coming on, and most of them had far to ride. They might have lingered until midnight, but this peculiar accident damped their spirits. Probably not 100 words were spoken from the moment Silent struck Dan to the time when the last of the cattlemen took to their saddles. They avoided each other's eyes as if in shame. In a short time, only Morgan remained working over Dan. In the house of old Joe Cumberland, the daughter sat fingering the keys of the only piano within many miles. The evening gloom deepened as she played with upward face and reminiscent eyes. The tune was uncertain, weird, for she was trying to recall one of those nameless airs which Dan whistled as he rode through the hills. There came a patter of swift, light footfalls in the hall, and then a heavy scratching at the door. "Down, Bart," she called, and went to admit him into the room. The moment she turned the handle, the door burst open, and Bart fell in against her. She cried out at sight of the gleaming teeth and eyes, but he fawned about her feet, alternately whining and snarling. "What is it, boy?" she asked, gathering her skirts close about her ankles and stepping back. For she never was without some fear of this black monster. "What do you want, Bart?" For reply, he stood stock still, raised his noise, and emitted a long wail, a ghastly sound with a broken-hearted quaver at the end. Kate Cumberland shrank back still farther until the wall blocked her retreat. Black Bart had never acted like this before. He followed her with green light in his eyes, which shone phosphorescent and distinct through the glowing shadows. And most terrible of all was the sound which came deep in his throat, as if his brute nature was struggling to speak human words. She felt a great impulse to cry out for help, but checked herself. He was still crouching about her feet. Obviously, he meant no harm to her. He turned and ran towards the door, stopped, looked back at her, and made a sound which was nearer to the bark of a dog than anything he had ever uttered. She made a step after him. He whined with delight, and he moved closer to the door. Now she stopped again. He whirled, ran back, caught her dress in his teeth, and made again for the door, tugging her after him. At last she understood, and she followed him. When she went towards the corral to get her horse, he planted himself in front of her and snarled so furiously that she gave up her purpose. She was beginning to be more and more afraid now. A childish thought came to her that perhaps this brute was attempting to lure her away from the house, as she had seen coyotes lure dogs. And then he'd turn his teeth against her, right? Nevertheless, she followed. Something in the dog's eagerness moved her deeply. When he led her out onto the road, he released her dress and trotted ahead a short distance, looking back and whining as if to beg her to go faster. For the first time, the thought of Dan came into her mind. Black Bart was leading her down the road toward Morgan's place. What if something had happened to Dan? She caught a breath of sharp terror and broke into a run. Bart yelped his pleasure, yet a cold horror rose in her heart as she hurried. Had her father, after all, been right? What power had Dan, if he needed her, to communicate with this beast and send him to her? As she ran, she wished for the day, the warm, clear sun, for these growing shadows of evening bred 1,000 ghostly thoughts. Black Bart was running backwards and forwards before her, as if he half entreated and half threatened. Her heart died within her as she came in sight of Morgan's place. There was only one horse before it, and that was the black stallion. Why had the others gone so soon? Breathless, she reached the door of the saloon. It was very dim within. She could make out only formless shades at first. Black Bart slid noiselessly across the floor. She followed him with her eyes, and then she saw a figure stretched straight out on the floor while another man kneeled at his side. She ran forward with a cry. Morgan rose, stammering. She pushed him aside and dropped beside Dan. A broad white bandage circled his head. His face was almost as pale as the cloth. Her touches went everywhere over that cold face, and she moaned little syllables that had no meaning. He lived, but it seemed to her that she had found him at the legendary gates of death. "Miss Kate," said Morgan desperately, "you murderer! You don't think that I did that. It happened in your place, and you had given Dad your word." Still she did not turn her head. "Won't you hear me explain? He's just in some sort of a trance. He'll wake up feeling all right. Don't try to move him tonight. I'll go out and put up his hoss in the shed. In the morning he'll be just as good as new, Miss Kate. Won't you listen to me?" She turned reluctantly towards him. Perhaps he was right, and Dan would waken from his swoon as if from a healthful sleep. "It was that big feller with them straight eyes that done it," began Morgan. "The one who was sneering at Dan? Yes. Yes. Weren't there enough boys here to string him up? Well, he had 3 friends with him. It would have taken 100 men to lay hands on one of those 4. They were all bad ones. I'm going to tell you how it was, because I'm leaving in a few minutes and riding south, and I want clear to my trail before I start. And this was the way it happened." His back was turned to the dim light which fell through the door. She could barely make out the movement of his lips. All the rest of his face was lost in shadow, and as he spoke she sometimes lost his meaning, and the stir of his lips became a nameless gibbering. The gray gloom settled out more deeply around the room and over her heart while he talked. He explained how the difference had risen between the tall stranger and Whistlin Dan, and how Dan had been insulted time and time again and borne it out with some sort of childish stupidity. And finally the blow had been struck. How Dan had crouched on the floor laughing, and how a yellow light gathered in his eyes. At that, her mind went blank. When her thoughts returned, she stood alone in the room. The clatter of Morgan's galloping horse died swiftly away down the road. She turned back to Dan. Black Bart was crouching at watch beside him. She kneeled again, lowered her head, and heard the faint but steady breathing. He seemed infinitely young, infinitely weak and helpless. The whiteness of the bandage stared up at her like an eye from the deepening gloom. All the mother in her nature came to her eyes in tears. Chapter 8. Red Riding. He stirred. "Dan, dear." "My head," he muttered. "It sort of aches, Kate, as if—" He was silent, and she knew that he remembered. "You're all right now, honey. I've come here to take care of you. I won't leave you, poor Dan." "How did you know?" he asked, the words trailing. "Black Bart came for me." "Good old Bart." The great wolf slunk closer and licked the outstretched hands. "Why, Kate, I'm on the floor and it's dark." Am I still in Morgan's place? Yeah, I seem to be seeing clearer now. He made an effort to rise, but she pressed him back. If you try to move right away, you may get a fever. I'm going back to the house, and I'll bring you down some blankets. Morgan says you shouldn't attempt to move for several hours. He says you've lost a great deal of blood and that mustn't make any effort or ride a horse till tomorrow. Dan relaxed with a sigh. Kate? Yes, honey? Her hand traveled lightly as blown snow across his forehead. He caught it and pressed the coolness against his cheek. I feel as if I'd sort of been through a fire. I seem to still be seeing red. Dan, it makes me feel as I never knew you. Now you must forget all that's happened. Promise me you will. He was silent for a moment, and then he sighed again. Maybe I can, Kate. Which I feel, though, as if there was something inside me written red letters. I got to try to read the writing before I can talk much. She barely heard him. Her hand was still again his face. A deep awe and content was creeping through her, so that she began to smile, and she was glad that the dark covered her face. She felt abashed before him for the first time in her life, and there was a singular sense of shame. It was as if some door in her inner heart had opened so that Dan was at liberty to look down into her soul. There was terror in his feelings, but there was also gladness. Kate. Yes, honey? What are you humming? She startled. I didn't know I was humming, Dan. You were all right. It sounded sort of familiar, but I couldn't figure out where I'd heard it. Oh, I know now. It's one of your tunes. Now she felt a tremor so strong that she feared he would notice it. I must go back to the house, Dan. Maybe Dad has returned. If he has, perhaps he can arrange to have you carried back tonight. I don't want to think of moving, Kate. I feel mighty comfortable, and I'm forgetting all about that ache in my head. Ain't that queer? Why, Kate, what in the world are you laughing about? I don't know, Dan. I'm just happy. Kate? Yes? I like you pretty much. I'm so glad. You and Black Bart and Satan? Oh, her tone changed. Why are you trying to take your hand away, Kate? Don't you care for me any more than for your horse and your dog? He drew a long breath, puzzled. It's some different, I figure. Tell me. Well, if Black Bart died, the wolf dog whined, hearing his name. Good old Bart. Well, if Black Bart died today, I'd someday have another dog I'd like almost as much. Yes? And if Satan died, even Satan, maybe I could sometime like another hoss pretty well, if he was a pile like Satan. But if you was to die, it'd be different. A considerable pile different. Why? His pauses to consider these questions were maddening. I don't know, he muttered at last. Once more she was thankful for the dark to hide her smile. Maybe you know the reason, Kate. Her laughter was rich music. His hold on her hand relaxed. He was thinking of a new theme. When he laughed in turn, it startled her. She'd never heard that laugh before. What is it, Dan? He was pretty big, Kate. He was bigger than almost any man I ever seen. It was kind of funny. After he hit me, I was almost glad. I didn't hate him. Dear Dan, I didn't hate him. I just naturally wanted to kill him. And wanting to do that made me glad. Isn't that funny, Kate? He spoke of it as a chance traveler might point out a striking feature of the landscape to a companion. Dan, if you really care for me, you must drop the thought of him. His hand slept away. How can I do that? That writing I was telling you about? Yes. It's about him. Ah. When he hit me the first time, I won't hear you tell of it. The blood came down my chin. Just a trickle of it. It was warm, Kate. That was what made me hot all through. Her hands fell limp, cold, lifeless. It's as clear as the print in a book. I've got to finish him. That's the only way I can forget the taste of my own blood. Dan, listen to me. He laughed again in a new way. She remembered that her father had dreaded the very thing that had come to Dan. This first taste of his own powers. This first taste, she shuddered, of blood. Dan, you've told me that you like me. You have to make a choice now between pursuing this man and me. You don't understand, he explained carefully. I got to follow him. I can't help it no more than Black Bart can help howling when he sees the moon. He fell silent, listening. Far across the hills came the plaintive wail of a coyote. That shrill, bodiless sound. Kate trembled. Dan! Outside, Satan whinnied softly like a call. She leaned and her lips touched his. He thrust away almost roughly. They's blood on my lips, Kate. I can't kiss you till they're clean. He turned his head. You must listen to me, Dan. Kate, would you talk to the wind? Yes, if I love the wind. He turned his head. She pleaded. Here are my hands to cover your eyes and shut out the thoughts of this man that you hate. Here are my lips, dear, to tell you that I love you unless this thirst for killing carries you away from me. Stay with me. Give me your heart to keep gentle. He said nothing, but even through the dark she was aware of a struggle in his face. And then, through the gloom, she began to see his eyes more clearly. They seemed to be illuminated from a light from within. They changed. There was a hint of yellow in the brown. And she spoke again, blindly, passionately. Give me your promise. It is so easy to do. One little word will make you safe. It will save you from yourself. Still he answered nothing. Black Bart came and crouched at his head and stared at her fixedly. Speak to me. Only the yellow light answered her. Cold fear fought in her heart, but love still struggled against it. For the last time, for God's sake, Dan. Still that silence. She rose, shaking and weak. The changeless eyes followed her. Only fear remained now. She leaned back towards the door slowly, then faster and faster. At the threshold she whirled and plunged into the night. Up the road she raced. Once she stumbled and fell to her knees. She cried out and glanced behind her, breathing again when she saw that nothing followed her. At the house she made no pause. Though she heard the voice of her father singing, she could not tell him. He should be the last in all the world to know. She went to her room and huddled into bed. Presently a knock came at her door, and her father's voice asked if she were ill. She pleaded that she had had a bad headache and wished to be alone. He asked if she had seen Dan. By a great effort, she managed to reply that Dan had ridden to a neighboring ranch. Her father left the door without further questions. Afterwards, she heard him in the distance singing his favorite mournful ballads. It doubled her sense of woe and brought home the clinging fear. She felt that if she could weep, she might live, but otherwise her heart would burst. And after hours and hours of that torture, what burns the name of woman in the soul of a girl? The tears came. The roosters announced the dawn before she slept. Late the next morning, old Joe Cumberland knocked again at her door. He was beginning to fear that his illness might be serious. Moreover, he had a definite purpose in rousing her. Yes, she called after a second knock. Look out your window, honey, down to Morgan's place. You remember I said I was going to clean up the landscape? The mention of Morgan's place cleared the sleep from Kate's mind, and it brought back the horror of the night before. Shivering, she slipped from her bed and went from the window. Morgan's place was a mass of towering flames. She grabbed the windowsill and stared again. It could not be. It must be merely another part of the nightmare and no reality. Her father's voice, high with exultation, came dimly to her ears. But what she saw was Dan as he had laid there the night before, hurt, helpless, too weak to move. There's the end of it, said Joe Cumberland, complacently outside her door. There ain't going to be even a shadow of that saloon left nor nothing that's in it. I just traveled down there this morning and touched a match to it. Still she stared without moving, without making a sound. She was seeing Dan as he must have wakened from a swoon-like sleep, with the smell of smoke and the heat of rising flames around him. She saw him struggle and fail to reach his feet. She almost heard him cry out, the sound drowned easily by the roar of the fire and the crackling of the wood. She saw him drag himself with his hands across the floor, only to be beaten back by a solid wall of flame. Black Bart crouched beside him and would not leave his doomed master. Fascinated by the raging fire, the black stallion would break from the shed and rush into the flames. And so the inseparable three must have perished together. "Why won't you speak, Kate?" called her father. "Dan," she screamed and pitched forward to the floor. Well, that was a heck of a story, folks, and thanks for coming. We had a good time this evening, and I got more of that story. I'm going to tell you the rest of it, too. We'll tell maybe next time I see you around this here campfire. So bring your mugs. Got something good to drink? Well, sit down and share some laughs and tell some more stories. So good night, folks, and until next time, this is Clay Steele. Be good.